The Cognitive Security Institute is dedicated to providing a forum for practitioners and researchers to discuss the fundamental cognitive security challenges of our time. The views expressed by presenters are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of, or endorsement by, the Cognitive Security Institute or any affiliated organizations. Dr. James Giordano, Ph.D., is the Pellegrino Center Professor in the Departments of Neurology and Biochemistry, Chief of the Neuroethics Studies Program, Co-Director of the Project in Brain Sciences and Global Health Law and Policy, and Chair of the Subprogram in Military Medical Ethics at Georgetown University Medical Center, Washington, D.C. Professor Giordano is Senior Bioethicist of the Defense Medical Ethics Center and Adjunct Professor of Psychiatry at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, Distinguished Stockdale Fellow in Science, Technology, and Ethics at the United States Naval Academy, Senior Science Advisory Fellow of the SMA Branch, Joint Staff, Pentagon, Non-Resident Fellow of the Simon Center for the Military Ethic at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, Distinguished Visiting Professor of Biomedical Sciences, Health Promotions, and Ethics at the Coburg University of Applied Sciences, Coburg, GUR, Chair Emeritus of the Neuroethics Project of the IEEE Brain Initiative, and serves as Director of the Institute for Biodefense Research, a federally funded Washington, D.C. think tank dedicated to addressing emerging issues at the intersection of science, technology, and national defense. He previously served as Donovan Group Senior Fellow, U.S. Special Operations Command, member of the Neuroethics, Legal, and Social Issues Advisory Panel of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and task leader of the Working Group on Dual Use of the EU Human Brain Project. Professor Giordano is the author of over 350 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and 50 governmental reports on science, technology, and biosecurity, and is an elected member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, UK, and a Fulbright Professorial Fellow. A former U.S. naval officer, he was winged as an aerospace physiologist and served with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Now, here is James.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so very, very much. And as somebody who has held and holds an active clearance at this point, what I will still advocate that what I tend to find is that things that occur in the high side space, and to some extent, even in the CUI, no foreign space, are very, very specific and can be very, very precise. Obviously, it's like looking at the world through a straw, as we discussed earlier. But I think there are 2 things that go along with that. Number one, there's a lot of really good intel in the low side space. And number 2, there's a lot of BS in both spaces. But I think where it becomes really very tractionable is to make sure that what happens on the low side is veridical, because there is a lot of nonsense out there. And the nonsense out there is primarily misinformational nonsense, whereas the nonsense, of course, that can occur on the high side is more administrative red tape. So trying to clear those 2 up so as to be able to get a clear trap, a real good runway, is really important to do. And I think a lot of the work needs to be done on the low side space, inclusive of broad-based professional and public education for those who don't have clearances and for those who even do, so they can take this back with them. That said, what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is the fusion of neural and computational sciences and what that really does to create an omnibus, if not a juggernaut of capability. I have my camera off for a reason. I've been told I have a great face for radio, and I don't want you to be distracted by the horrificness of my visage, but rather pay attention to the information that I'm providing to you. I tend to use slides the way a drunkard uses a light post, both for illumination and support. And so the slides will both illuminate and support key points that I wish to present to you, not least of which there's been a number of people over the years who've been very fond of my work and very generous to me, and much of the work I'll present today comes from these levels of support, and each and all of these are noted here. As well, in disclaimer, nothing I'm about to tell you here is representative of the views, opinions, or perspectives of the United States government, NATO, the Department of Defense, or any of those organizations and institutions that have funded my work. These views are my own. But if we jump into the pool of information, one of the things that I've noticed as a practicing neuroscientist for the past 40 odd years, particularly working in the multinational space of both the applications of neuroscience as a science with biomedical engagement and utility, as well as its potential dual usability and the very realized possibility of dual use research of concern being translated into national security, intelligence, and defense operations, both tactically and more strategically, is that much of the brain sciences have been realized through the use of big data and iterative versions of machine learning, decision technology, which we can group under a larger rubric of AI, which we'll talk about momentarily. So if we actually look at these things, they're no longer separate entities per se. They're force multiplying, complementary, and reciprocal entities. And in fact, the nomenclature that my research group has taken to use, inclusive of within the five-sided building, is this moniker, ChemBio and Data Computational Science and Tech. And what this really illustrates is that reciprocity of task, tool, and theory. I don't know if any of you dance, and I'm certainly not going to ask you for a dance at the end or during this lecture. But if you think about a well-articulated dance, and let me give you one that I think is the perfect exemplar. Think of an Argentine tango. My partner and I like the Argentine tango. And as I tell her all the time, I am the man. I must lead. And as she reminds me repeatedly, she's the one who makes me look good. Which gets to a question. Who's making who look good and who's really leading? And this is the same issue with this triangulation of task, tool, and theory. There are tasks out there. There are things we want to do. And very often we approach them with the rudimentary tools of those that we have at our availability. They can be tools of observation. They can be tools of our experience. And from those, we develop some theoretical approach, some knowledge about the task or what the task involves, entails, or obtains. But then we come to the limit of that theory, or we come to the limit of our capability to do the task, and we have to invent new tools. And by inventing those new tools, very often what we then do is go back and revise the theory and or now begin to look for new tasks to which we can now use these tools. And very often those secondary, tertiary, quaternary tasks far more complicated than the original ones because we got the toolkit to do it. This really reflects what is referred to as the knowing, doing, reciprocity, and complementarity. And in reality, as a neuroscientist, I can tell you that many of the developments in neuroscience, inclusive of many of the technological developments in neuroscience, have only been capitalized and realized through the use of ever-increasing engines and methods of acquiring, assimilating, synthesizing, and using data across a range of scales from the subcellular all the way to the social, from the molecular to the mass effect, from the individual all the way to the international. And realistically, the only way to process those data is by using iterative forms of ever more sophisticated, complicated, and capable machine learning, decision technology, which are ultimately being fed into this larger enterprise that we refer to as artificial intelligence. But in reality, those arrows go in two ways. And I think it becomes important to appreciate these when we take a look at not only how ChemBio and neuroscience are interactive with the data sciences or things that are biomedically applicable for what I'll call the low-hanging fruit of medical benevolence, wanting to do good, but the less than low-hanging and somewhat ambiguous fruit of nation states and perhaps even individual actors and non-state actors and proxies of wanting to preserve what they feel is good through the use of these most advanced scientific and technological means and methods. Let me preface this for you real quickly, a little what I'll call an ethical wake-up call. I don't care where you choose to point your accusative or attributional finger. There is no group that goes off to some bellicose engagement. In other words, there's no group that postures, prepares, and engages a fight thinking that they suck. Nobody goes into battle thinking we're the bad guys. Come on. We love to point our finger at those nasty Nazis from World War II upon which the entire edifice of contemporary bioethics is based, Nuremberg doctors' trials. But let's not forget, in 2 world wars, the German army marched off with the words, "God is with us," emblazoned on their belt buckle, which is wholly emblematic of basically any group's feeling about why they would use any tool, any instrument, any technique to be able to defend what they feel is good or right, or to advance what they believe is a viable ideology, worldview. Again, in our view, from an open liberal democracy, what we see is the role of the military is indeed to protect the polis, and the body politic itself, politics, serves that polis, at least at present. However, understand that even in those situations, what does that then mean to protect the polis? What things are on the table to be able to do that? We like to talk about these large-scale constructs of justifiable engagement of warfare and just use of techniques and technologies in warfare, but there's one other that looms large from the original Augustinian maxim, and that's called jus contra bellum, which means justification to prevent warfare. How far are we ready to go on the non-kinetic side to be able to create leverage that produces the necessary hegemony that has disruptive and or deterrent effect? And that's where we're really seeing more and more of the science and technology being dedicated, being devoted, and essentially being directed. So if we look at where chem bio agents are in this relative conflict hierarchy of a group's armamentarium, it's presented here in this slide. We see relative engagement going from things like the ecological, legal, economic, drug, smuggling, psychological media, etc., moving all the way up the scale to frank warfare. And within that warfare, you have conventional warfare, and then you also have those things that move along this sliding scale that can be somewhat more unconventional, even in a symmetrical engagement, that have a very strong non-kinetic component, and that non-kinetic component may be either clandestine or overtly covert. But more and more what we're seeing is the use of these types of agents for deterrence and disruption rather than mass destruction. Current changing narratives about baby nukes aside, what we are seeing is that there is indeed an evolving narrative that must look at what these types of disruptions really are and what we have in the toolkit, which is why essentially, if we move to the right of this slide, I illustrate that to you. What we see are things like intrusion and detection, kinetic and non-kinetic true warfare engagement, commercial and economic effects, affecting the Internet of Things. And these are accessible and defectable by various vulnerabilities and risk assessment tools, by our current armamentarium, and some of the novel and new aspects of that armamentarium. Novel being things that we have to date, but now we can modify. New things are brand new, inclusive of those things coming out of gene editing and synthetic biology. The application of these to neuroscientific systems, where now what we're doing is we're seeing the brain as the contemporary battlescape, and increasingly the use of technologies, both to be able to enable neuroscientific and neurocognitive warfare and engagements, and so that neuroscience and neurocognitive capabilities can then be fed into data and artificial intelligence systems. Why is this so important, and why does my research group, coupled with others, inclusive of the cognitive warfare branch of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, see this as a clear and present, if not risk, certainly threat, and in some cases, present danger? Because in many cases, what we know is this is going beyond the current language and limitations, constrictions, and governances of the biological toxins, chemical weapons conventions. Emerging threats in the chem, bioscience, and technological space include synthetic bioagents, a variety of modifiable and modified microbes, utilizing gene editing techniques. And in this case, what we're looking at in both of those, what we now call precision pathologies. This reflects much of my ongoing work with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Diane Deulis of National Defense University. We just got a paper published literally this week in the journal Frontiers in Medicine in their precision medicine branch that looks at how the tools of precision medicine that are used biomedically in applications for treating the sick, eradicating disease, mitigating the effects of illness, and in some cases preventatively to avoid what may then be the incurrence of disease, insult, and injury by genetic modification are easily adaptable in those ways that threaten public health, public safety, national stability, and global biosecurity. And here too, what we find is that the emerging palette of capable technologies doesn't just stop at those things that are molecular, microbial, or the idea of precision pathologies, but literally engages new dimensions of bioengineering, most notably nanotechnologies. And given my sandbox, which exists primarily above the neck in the brain space, we're very concerned about nanoneurotechnologies, vectorable nanomaterials, aerosolizable nanomaterials, and nanobots. Break here for a minute. About 6, 7 years ago, I gave a presentation out in LA to a group of individuals from the Directors Guild of America. It was something the Science and Entertainment Exchange put on. It was called the Night of Mass Destruction. And I was talking to this group about nano-engineered substances, nano-engineered materials, and the assembly of what may then be nano-engineered capable devices. In other words, nanobots. And I used that word in a sentence. People came after me with like wood and cross. I mean, it was like you were going to string me up and nail me to the cross at Golgotha. You know, like, this is an impossibility. This is not going to happen. This is science fiction. Let me tell you something I've learned being a scientist for almost 5 decades. If you get your finger on the pulse of what's happening in science and technology, you're going to be proved right and you're going to be proved wrong. In this particular case, that technological readiness level was not at the appreciative point of operationalizability some 6 or 7 years ago, but it was fast-tracked. And now these very same nanomaterials, nano devices, represent the cutting edge of being able to vector into the brain space non-surgically to be able to create remote capability to read from the living brain and to read and write into the living brain. Each and all of these domains of what are characteristically the chem-bioweaponology space are force multiplied by the use of an overall paradigm called integrative scientific convergence. One of my colleagues, Dr. Ashok Vashasta, has written extensively about advanced integrative scientific convergence, and I refer you to Vashasta's work because I think it's seminal in that regard. But what the idea is behind the paradigm is a conjoinment, a practical conjoinment of the physical sciences, natural sciences, anthropological and social sciences, and engineering. De-siloing these things, taking them out of their siloed space so that information going in goes into all of these, information coming out comes out of all of these. Identification of gaps, analysis of gaps, and closure of those gaps occur as conjoined integrative scientific approaches that are interdisciplinary and by their nature, therefore, multidimensional. And appreciating the anthropological and social scientific needs, wants, and in some cases, volatilities and vulnerabilities is certainly operable when taking a look at the way integrative scientific convergence can be used in those ways to develop national, military, political leverage, hegemony, and power. In other words, using it as means of contending against another. Let me say that one more time. Means of contending against others. That's a formal Oxford English Dictionary definition of a weapon. So although we may not be considering these as your sort of formal types of weapons, bombs, bullets, tanks, ships, and planes, we certainly are considering these with regard to the CBRNE armamentarium. And here, in this particular space, what we're looking at is an armamentarium that consists of bugs, drugs, toxins, devices, and data, and the big scale systems necessary to utilize those data in cogent ways. So what we see is that all of this, the integrative scientific components, both individually and writ large, are reliant upon data integration, sharing, and use. And all of these big data aspects require some form of machine learning for their assimilation, their synthesis, their real-time access, and their distributional application. Because what these things do when taken together is they allow validity to be assessed and realized, veridicality to come from that realization of the validity, increase their viability for use, increase the volume and velocity of use, data, and real-time capability and tools, and as a consequence, increase the value of each and all of the subcomponents of integrative scientific convergence and all of them taken together. What do big data approaches afford the chem biosciences, writ large, not just the neurosciences, but taken together? Basically 4 things. Number 1, excellent big data approaches maximize storage and retrieval of massive amounts of multidimensional, multi-domain data across a range of scales and levels. Big data approaches allow for and establish the basis for parallel computing, break, but you're going to need the systems to do that. Pause, downstream, we'll talk about that in a moment. Certainly, big data approaches and the tools are scalable and customizable. And by their very nature, they need to be accessible and shareable. We want to have those data to be shared in ways that sometimes are restricted and other times are custodianized. And those custodializations require distinct vectors for who gets shared what. But as I'll tell you in a moment, that's one of the caveats with regard to big data systems. Who's sharing what? Who has access to these data? What data are they? How are the data being used? And who is using them in these ways? When we're talking about the type of data that are in fact currently available within the RANIANT systems of operationalizable use, what we see is that individual data can be accumulated across an entire lifespan based upon, listen, existing data records. There is, in fact, an informational fingerprint of you that is accessible and defectable online. The history of you, particularly if that you is somewhere between 2 years old, 1 year old, and 70 years old, means that fingerprint, that informational fingerprint, that data print of you is in fact an accessible data print, which then gives us not only lifespan data of you, but time span data. What were you doing and what are your data when you were a little kid, when you were an adolescent, when you were post-adolescent, various stages of employ, adulthood, etc., which can then be used to aggregate point data to be able to allow metadata analytics. That's just of you. And increasingly, this is becoming a reality given the ubiquity of things that have your data fingerprint on them and are therefore accessible by virtue of not only the present data you're using, what are you Googling, what are you looking at online, what information are you giving out to be able to have passwords, to be in new computer systems, to be able to have variable accesses in your points of employ or avocation. All of those things are then yokeable. They're all linkable. They're all stackable. And those individual data of your time and lifespan can then also be compared to cohort data. If you've ever ordered anything off of Amazon and you place the order and what comes back at you is, hey, if you really like the Godzilla statue action figure, you'll love, and then it gives you all this other stuff. It's like, well, where did that come from? And then it keeps sending you stuff. Here's something you might be interested in. Okay, why am I now interested in like a Japanese phrase book? Because you bought the Godzilla action figure. Got it. Well, how do you think that's happening? There are comparative engines that allow the methodological comparison between those things that are key to those indices of data with various cohorts. And the cohorts have what's called cohort specificity and drift. These are people who also ordered Godzilla figures who may be just like you in a lot of the parameters. In the United States, who drive, I don't know, a Jeep Wrangler, blah, 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 blah. But then you also get cohort drift. Okay, who's done some things that had to do with Godzilla in the past, who may not drive a Jeep Wrangler, or who has a Jeep Wrangler who may have, for example, ordered sashimi online. And although sashimi is not Godzilla, you get the idea. And then ultimately, those data can also be compared with and fed up into populational data. That level of upward group analytics, where you're going what's called I to G, in other words, individual to group, that represents comparatives. But where you're then going group to individual, that's not only comparative, that's normative. And you can view this as some type of quasi-Gaussian distribution. And along with this come particular meanings and inferences of what those placements within that normal distribution may mean. And what we're talking about here is meaning on a lot of levels. Certainly informational levels, but those informational levels as reflect things like your biopsychosocioeconomic and ecological realities, preferences, choices, values, and how those things are regarded and treated based upon who's ever doing the regard and ultimately responsible for the treatment. One of the things we can do right now, and here is a deep bow of homage to two colleagues of mine. Number one, a colleague who I work with at Georgetown, Professor Ophir Frieder, and a professor who I've worked with in Europe, whose name is Albrecht von Müller, at the Parmenides Institute in Germany, creates something that is shown here. It's a nodogram. This is not just two-dimensional or representational, but this actually represents is a functional hierarchization and interactive capability of various pools or spheres of data that are currently accessible and therefore accessible and affectable about you. We can pull up your genomic data together with your phenomic data. In other words, how do those genes contribute to and how are they expressed in your physical being biopsychosocially? How has that been expressed and how has that been manifest historically across your lifespan, as we saw here? And then in real time, how are you utilizing the economics, in other words, those resources and goods of your various medical interactions? This demonstrates, for example, where your particular vulnerabilities may lie, various allergies, sensitivities, what drugs are you taking, what conditions have you had or have? And then clearly also, we can measure those types of things that are far more psychobehavioral and social. Various types of media engagements, inclusive of what type of websites you're going to, what you're looking at online, on WebMD, etc., your various contacts and communications, and ultimately correlate those to your behaviors. What are you buying? What are you using? Where are you going? All of these things are accessible in real time. This is much of the work, as I said, of Ophir Frieder, who's demonstrated that the current or the radiant capability and ubiquity of information about you allows a very potent level of tracking. And if we then couple that to the reality that the upper component of this notogram, the psychosocioecological component, is dynamically interactive with the lower, which is, if you will, the biopsychological component, we can then drill down to see how these two things are interactively viable and perhaps vulnerable. And even if we're just looking at the data and we're not using the data necessarily to do anything physical to you, an interesting component of this data notogram exists in its structural reality. Now, I'm talking to you as a guy who's played martial arts for about 35 years, and I was a high school and collegiate and then post-collegiate wrestler. And for those of you who met me in person, you know that I'm about the size of a garden gnome. And being the size of a garden gnome, one of the things that we learned early on in both my martial arts judo training and in my wrestling training is very often people are strongest where they sort of plant, but they're very, very weak at their articulation points. Go for the joints. Go for the hinges. Go for the places where they're going to bend. Go for the places where they flex, where they extend. Because that's where you'll then be able to find various momentums of where their center of gravities are, and as a consequence, change, if you will, the moment arm of their stability. Same is true here. Consider each one of these data portals that are used for data and computational science to be spheres, not circles, spheres that rotate, that grow and shrink as a consequence of the data that is in them. And moreover, they rotate, they revolve so that particular data points may then be accessible and linkable to other types of data. But you'll note that the sophistication, the capabilization of such a notogram when used operationally is not in a single data porta, historical, phenomic, medical, behavioral, but how these things link. For this to work, these data must be stacked, which gets us to a very important set of caveats. If these data are accessible, they're accessible. That's axiomatic to the way big data must work to be then paired with various forms of machine learning, and what those data and machine learning then infer for the system upon which they're both providing information and providing access, in this case, ChemBio. We can tag these data. And if you tag the data, they're targetable. But here comes the big one. These data require stackability to be able to work interoperatively within this form of scientific convergence. And folks, if it's stackable, if it's hackable. Ergo, what's hackable is manipulable, and what's controllable and manipulable is corruptible. Simply modifying these forms of data can in fact be weaponized. Clearly, big data science and technology require computational science and tech for acquisition, assimilation, synthesis, and access across domains, across various levels from individual to population, across geographic loci, which essentially gives us complete geospatial access, if you will. Realistically, I can get data from someone in Tokyo right now, as well as somebody who's in New Delhi, as well as somebody who's in Johannesburg. I can also do this across time spans, both individually as well as historically and populationally. And I can do this, as we mentioned earlier, comparatively and normatively. So clearly, to be able to use big data in these ways, particularly ChemBio data about individuals and groups, requires computational science and technology. That computational science and technology is equally engaged in a tools to theory to tools dance. If you were to look at this somewhat hierarchically, where the borders between what constitutes what are truly, quote, fuzzy zones, we'll see you have what's called deep learning, training algorithms using neural networks, machine learning, again, algorithms to solve tasks that essentially engage pattern recognition, and true artificial intelligence. And as I'll show you in a moment, artificial intelligence is parsable into two generalized but not mutually exclusive entities, soft AI and hard AI, which is then hierarchical. But what's important to understand when you take a look at this is that each and all of these areas of computational science and technology are being directly applied to ChemBio systems use, fieldability, and operationalizability, both within mainstream biomedicine for what I'll call benevolent medical means of care and cure and heal, as well as for their dual usability. That poses a double-edged blade. Balance is critical to that double-edged blade. And of course, one of the things we recognize is that double-edged blade has a handle. Interestingly, the handle and the blade become somewhat interchangeable. As I mentioned previously, there are essentially two modes or themes, as we call them, of artificial intelligence. Soft AI is to make computers more sophisticated. And then increasingly, we're making those computers more sophisticated so that they can do what humans do and have the eventuality of being a thinking machine, not just a Turing type thinking machine, but a true thinking machine, one that certainly has cognitive processes that can actually perhaps reach right onto the point of sentience. Now, what's important to understand is that the arrows now go both ways. What we're learning from the brain sciences and cognitive sciences are being fed into machine learning and computational systems to make them more neuromorphically similar. What we mean by that is that it's not that these systems themselves, these AI systems, are designed with units that are like neurons, nerve cells. They're not. They're what we call neuroanalogous. They work the way nodes and networks of neurons work in hierarchically more complex organisms. And I'll tell you, as a brain scientist, despite what you may have heard in the past, whether in the context of brain science or elsewhere, size doesn't always matter. It ain't the size of the wand, it's the magic it brings. Feel free to quote me, and if you want a prescription, I'll be happy to write you one. What I mean by that is it's not necessarily how many nerve cells you pack into that particular core, but how complicated the function of those nerve cells are. How reciprocally and dynamically interactive, how capably and flexibly they're able to shift their node architectures to do different things at different times under different circumstances. You don't need a lot of nerve cells or nerve cell-like units to do the job. Let's face it, folks, your cell phone is able to do what the mega computers that put humans on the moon in 1969 do. And although you've probably heard that analogy used over and over again, the truth of it is that what we're looking at is a shift in the level of structure and function. It's not a question of just bigger, it's a question of better. It's not a question of more capacitous in terms of size, it's capacitous in terms of actual capability. This is where you're really seeing the reciprocity. What we're learning more and more about the brain is being accomplished through the use of big data and AI that allows us to analyze neuroscientific investigations and research far more sophisticatedly and granularly. And what we're learning about the brain is then being fed into big data and computational systems to make them more capabilized and far more capacitous. Question, however, if we're developing these systems that are capable of this level of cognitive ability, where do we stand? Literally, where do we as humans stand? If what we're doing is we're creating neuromorphic systems designs so that the system itself takes on the entities of some form of ecology or embodiment, where are we? Clearly, these things aren't necessarily existing in us, despite what Elon Musk may tell you about Neuralink. And there is certain possibilities to open up these doors of things called brain-computer interfacing. One of the more, again, advanced projects in this regard is a DARPA project called N-Cubed, Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation, which involves the use of nanomaterials that can be introduced to the brain space non-surgically that allow real-time communication and control. But we're very comfortable, we in the United States and among our allies, being in the loop. But increasingly, what we're also learning is being in the loop may be a spoil for the system. It inhibits the system in certain ways. If what we want is for this to be a reciprocally cooperative system, then being in the loop might be an impediment. It might essentially slow the system down, or in some cases, even incur biases that render the system relatively ineffective or in some cases inefficient. So perhaps we need to be on the loop, where the machines are doing the bulk of the work and human involvement is a check periodically at various key points or sentinel points during the development of certain deliverables or products or outputs. But that represents a parochial view. That is not a universally accepted view. And one of the things I can tell you is that there are certain views within the AI community and within machine learning community and the way big data systems are organized and employed that strongly endorse the fact that humans should be out of the loop. That machines have become and can become so accurate and self-sufficient to continue independent and autonomous operation, whereby humans either in or on the loop are then seen as a true impediment. More than that, however, humans can produce stigmatization or bias within the system, whereby the system is then seen as pure. Not science fiction, not social fiction. This represents an ideological and construct paradigm that is well held and widely maintained by our trans-Pacific peer competitor. But irrespective of whatever the looping is, or whether the systems are being used to create more deep advances in the brain sciences and how we can use synthetic gene editing to create precision pathologies and how we can use the brain sciences to create ever more autonomous and capable machines. One of the things we need to understand is that these advances in data and computational sciences are increasing almost linearly with regard to accuracy, diversity, scalability, speed, volume, and workability for uses in practice inclusive of national security and defense applications as a consequence of time. How much time? Stand by. 4 calendar months. Let me say it again. How much time? For almost linear advances to occur in certain domains and dimensions of the field, 4 calendar months. Evolutionary shifts in integrative sciences occur approximately every 120 to 160 days via the formulation or the development of some concept into a usable construct or widget. It's a huge leftward shift in compression in the time to efficacy curve, whereby we can get to technological and scientific readiness levels that are very capable and therefore operationalizable within a very short amount of time. Break. Bottom line, this stuff is here. This stuff is moving in these directions, relatively linear, on a relatively global scale. We are not the only ones who are doing it. And in fact, the internationality of this is such is that our trans-Pacific peer competitors are actually leading the field as relates to pace. Perhaps not scope, but certainly pace. And that pace is instrumental and performative to a broadening scope inclusive of a viable scope for national security, intelligence, and defense uses, given that many of the impediments or constraints that occur as a consequence of the system and architectures of our particular government and its relationship with the research enterprise and the commercial enterprise is such that if you were to create a more seamless entity, a more fluid triple helix, if you will, of government, research, and commercialization, these things would flow far more quickly. Look, with anything that might have beneficial aspect with regard to speed and or pace of production and therefore possibility and promise, certainly bears some potential for those things that are problematic as well. And here the thing we're worried about is politicization of the research enterprise and of the commercial enterprise. And of course, in a collectivist state, such as our trans-Pacific competitor, and to some extent our transatlantic competitor, engaging in this type of research, although along some different parameters of effect and dedication, we have to appreciate there are certain aspects of their cultural, national, political, economic, and ecological realities that capabilize their science to move it along somewhat faster than we're doing to date. I think one of the important things that is a sentinel point there is that they're operating in accordance with a strategic plan. I pose the question to each and all of you, what's ours? Particularly in this S&T space with regard to both direct uses in the economic, ecological, and biomedical fields, and certainly its dual uses for those things that are able to create leverage, hegemony in the national stability, national safety, and biosecurity space. And where this really comes clamoring home is when we take a look at these entities as a single juggernaut. If we really see the complementarity and reciprocity of the way the ChemBio and neurocognitive sciences are operating and iterative computational sciences, where big data science and technology represent the force multipliers that allow this thing to become, if you will, a discrete entity that is leverageable, capable, usable, both at present and in the near future. The question is, what will these things be used for? How will what we're learning about the brain and cognitive systems through the use of big data and computational science and technology be used for biological leveraging, for example, to understand, to assess, to affect, to access the brains of individuals, groups of individuals, and how we treat those individuals, not only utilizing neuro tools per se, but even the way we use things like narratives, symbols, interactions, human terrain teaming. And how is it then also that what we're learning about neurocognitive systems on a variety of scales, based upon the architectural and the articulative, then contribute to advances in computational sciences that are ever more creating what may be viable autonomous machine systems that have broad cognitive capacity and perhaps even capabilities for some form of sentience and decision-making in accordance with core sets of precepts and principles that we might consider to be proto-moral, proto-ethical? Let's ask the question, whose morality? Whose ethics? So what we're really calling for here is a view to the future that then demands readiness and preparation in the present. But one of the things that our group has recognized when doing this kind of modeling and gaming is that things get a little difficult as we're moving towards these various future vistas. Here I'm illustrating for you some of the work of my colleague Joseph DeFranco and Maureen Riemann, again working with my colleague Diane DeUlis and I, in which we've actually taken a look at the variability of, again, future vistas and relative predictive value. If we take a look at this, we can break this down into three, what we call horizons or vistas. From the present to the next 5 years, we call the vista of probability. In other words, what things are on the bench, so to speak, that are going to be realized, have a high T or SRL, a technical and scientific readiness level. They're going to create probable realization, actualization, creation of a tool within the next 60 calendar months. Well, based upon that, we can take a look at the next vista, which is from 6 years to 15 years in the future. That predictability horizon is referred to as the vista of possibilities. In other words, as we realize certain probabilities, more things can become possible. It's if A, then B, if B, then C, et cetera, et cetera. But as we move forward, past the 15-year point, you then get into the horizon and vista of potentiality. And this is where things get a little iffy, if you will. Now, again, working with another colleague of ours, Dr. Jamie Canton out on the West Coast, this is his area of real expertise. He's a futurist. And so he's, if you will, his work day begins at about the 15-year onward space. But even Jamie will tell you, even Dr. Canton will tell you that one of the things that tends to happen is you look at the relative areas under the curve. And what we see is if you take a look at these things, predictability tends to go down as a consequence of time, and the percentage and diversities of applications increases as a consequence of time. Because you're bringing those things that are probable into the possible, and the possibilities into the potential, and this then engages them in the vagaries and relative ambiguities of the social space, the ecological space, the political and military space of the new global reality. So recognizing this, understanding the reality of this, allows us to at least begin to develop methods or accountings of our methods for readiness and preparedness. And one of the things we must recognize is that we are not the only players in the field. The global site picture just 4 years ago recognize that indeed a trans-Pacific competitor is on pace to outspend both the United States and the European Union by a whole order of magnitude over the next 10 years, which, ladies and gentlemen, puts us for only 6 years in the future. By the next year, literally by 2025, taking a look at economic estimates with regard to devotion of not only central capital and core capital, but specific devotion of capital interest activities and both explicit and tacit dedication of personnel, resources, and services to these areas of integrative science and convergence, we see a 60 to 68% increase in research, development, testing, evaluation within the next year. If we just take a look at it economically, again, here I cite some of the work of my colleague Joe DeFranco and Dr. Maureen Riemann. What we're seeing is that China is predicted to capture greater than 53% of the market share in these areas of ChemBio, basically all of those areas of chemistry and biology, inclusive of bio devices, coupled with big data and AI, equally by next year. But if we look forward for the next 5 years, essentially to 2025 to 2030, we certainly can see that China is not the only player. We see certain activities occurring in Russia, Iran, North Korea, virtual nations, and increasingly the use of proxies, whereby various aspects of the science and technology are being fielded or farmed out to proxies for their use in a variety of ways that makes it difficult for what we call national state attribution. In other words, if a proxy or a non-state actor is using a particular thing a particular way, and if in fact they're discovered, the first question is, well, where'd you get this stuff? Did you make this yourself? If not, where did it come from? And very often, the nature of that level of custodianship is obscured, is grayed, is fuzzed, so as to be able to create ambiguities in attribution, which then keep many of these things behind at least a commercial veil, if not truly a covert and clandestine veil. But I think the take-home message here is critical, and this is something that my colleague Diane DeUlis and I have tried to beat the drum about over the past 6-7 years. A lack of focus and commitment to biosecurity, and particularly the interface of the bio and chem sciences with those cyber tools that force multiply and realize them, this entity now called cyber biosecurity, opens the door for exponential growth opportunities for exploitation by our peer competitors. Look, I spend about half of my time working as an ethicist. The science hat stays on, the ethics hat just goes on top of that. And if we were to take a look at what these ethical issues and risks are, we could break them down into two intersecting domains, those that are technologically focal. Let's face it, we're dealing with the brain and we're dealing with new technology, so these are intersecting unknowns. They're brand new. We don't know what the intermediate or long-term effects of their conjoined use might be. What are the real capabilities? What are the real limitations, not only when taken singularly, but when taken in tandem or in pairings and complexities? How valid are the results and how viable are their uses? And the other issue is, what happens if the technology runs away from us? Not only in terms of what the tech does, but with regard to our capability of constraint and governance. And the other issue is, what happens if the technology really does run away from us? That's called the Vexelblad effect. That's to say, nature has a nasty sense of humor. Case in point, if in fact what we're doing is we're utilizing big data and artificial intelligence to be able to generate various permutations and combinations of microbes to see which microbes might be most capable of various forms of mutability and change that would then render them zoonotic, capable of jumping from an animal species, perhaps to a human species, that same set of technologies that capabilizes that for protective use might be equally viable in producing a precision pathogen and letting it loose on the world. Break, folks. I'm not telling you that the entirety of the past COVID crisis was due to the intentional production of a bioweapon. But what I am telling you is that the same tools that are necessary for our protection with regard to our biosafety and biosecurity, in this case, gain of function research, are so capabilized, are so sophisticated, that we may not yet be aware of the relative potential of problems that can arise from their application in the real world. Did something leak out of the laboratory that in fact did not view in the laboratory setting to be viable for cross-contamination, but once it got back out in the wild, took off like wildfire? Yes, very likely. It's exactly what happened. And we've gone on record as saying that. Does that rule out gain-of-function research? No, because gain-of-function research is a viable stance for readiness and preparedness to be able to understand how various microbes or things that perhaps humans may be producing through synthetic biology and gene editing could have destructive and disruptive effects on a variety of scales. But once again, what goes along with that is the necessity to revisit and in some cases revise, and in other cases completely replace those radiant systems, controls, and governances of biosafety and biosecurity, inclusive of those things that exist in the cyberspace. Because the cyberspace and the reality of that cyberspace engages the social domain, both informationally as well as the actual instruments and tools once the cat's let out of the bag. Obviously, we're dealing with individuals. You have to deal with, well, do they know what's going on? Or do we maintain autonomy of individuals and systems? Who gets what? And all of these play particular roles with regard to dual use, which then really can be distilled down into some core questions and issues. And I pose these for you in the spirit of the philosopher and historian of science, Bruno Latour. Not that science necessarily provides answers, and I'll take that charge. Not that I'm providing you with answers, but I would like to leave you with non-rhetorical, but I think are very realizable and addressable questions. And they are as follows. What do we do with the information and capability we have? What will we do about the information and capability in these spheres, spaces, and domains that we lack? And given what can be done in the chem biosciences based upon the capabilities of the data and computational sciences, and reciprocally vice versa, what can be done in the computational and data sciences based upon what we're learning from the neurocognitive sciences, what should we do? What should we not do? And who will decide? And even after we've decided, and one of the things that may be important, for example, is to revisit the current language of international signatory treaties and various conventions, such as the Biological Toxins and Chemical Weapons Conventions. And this is something that my colleague Dan Gerstein has advocated very strongly. And certainly, again, Diane Deulis and I have jumped on that train to bang that drum equally strongly. And we published this in the peer-reviewed literature and a number of documents within the government. And there's been some good moves in these directions. I think the Australia group in the Revisitation and Review Council of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Conventions of a few years ago made, I think, influential steps in this direction. But it needs to be more than that. Far more than that. The discourse needs to appreciate the multinationality of the effort and the enterprise, and as such needs to take a cosmopolitan lens and recognize, hey, in some cases, various cultures' histories, needs, values, politics give rise to distinct philosophies, ethics, and those philosophies and ethics may be in some cases more permissive, and that permissivity may advance the pace of science and technology in ways that we need to be prepared for. And this brings us head on into the ongoing dilemmas here. Yeah, this type of science and technology is very useful for the prevention of certain biomedical things that can be devastating to the human condition, human predicament, but it also allows us the capability to intrude upon individuals' privacy. Yeah, but we're using these things in protective ways. These type of data, for example, that are accumulated over a lifespan for individuals that are then paired with cohorts, groups, and populations, absolutely can be used in protective ways so as to prevent various things from happening to them, both informationally as well as instrumentally and pathologically. Yeah, but what about personal liberties and rights? But these are all important to public health. The chem biosciences are critical, as we saw from the COVID crisis, failure to respond, failure to be prepared, failure to acknowledge that there are ongoing programs such as Crimson Contagion that essentially set the stage and modeled it, that would then not take it into the reality to obtain protection. Oh, that could be devastating. Yeah, but by the same token, if these things are uptaken into particular political agenda or military agenda in key ways, they can affect how we regard and treat others. And certainly some of those treatments may involve the use of computational data as well as actual chemical biological interventions. So this really brings us into how we're going to approach the problem. Our group has been working over the past several years to determine some type of ethical paradigm for at least addressing these issues and questions, if not resolving them, on the 21st century world stage. And we've come away with really what we call 4 basic pillars of what needs to be done. It has to be cosmopolitically cognizant. We're not the only ones who are developing this. And what used to be called, quote, the West is now a player in a larger global enterprise and endeavor that is very, very scientifically and technologically competent. Whatever it is that we do has to also be capable within the communities of use. In some cases for us, but equally appreciative of what may be good for them, whoever they are. But then what happens then, indeed, when you then become more intertwined? The reality of the scientific and technological global reality, or global milieu, global stage, is that our science and technology de-silos our national identities and our national realities. We engage with other nationalities on a variety of levels all the time. Can we really keep information siloed? Can we really surveil? Can we really engage? And what do those engagements mean? And what do they look like? And how do we provide those levels of oversight, guidance, and governance? To do so, we have to at least acknowledge, if not accommodate, various plural needs, values, norms, and mores. And as these are affected by and affect economics, politics, and power balances, our group has created, if you will, a risk assessment and mitigation paradigm, we call a RAMP approach. This is an operational novel technologies RAMP approach. We called it on-ramp. We were chartered by DARPA in 2014 to do this, and we published the results between 2015 and 2017, and they continue to obtain. It begins by posing 6 questions. What sciences and technologies are available for use? Why are those sciences and new sciences considered advocated for use? Who's going to get it? When? What's the algorithm? What's the protocol? Where? Locally? Nationally? Within various domains? Which mechanisms will be in place for ongoing provision of services and resources, if nothing else, to remain current and remain apace with the pace of science and development, inclusive of the possibility for revision or retraction if things go wrong or go to hell in a handbasket? But these questions have to be framed by real-world considerations. What are the actual capacities and limitations of the science and technology? And what are the capacities and limitations of those organizations, institutions, and publics that are having to deal with them? What are the consequences incurred by use or non-use of the science and technology on individuals, on systems, across a range of scales and temporal levels? What is the character of the use case and share and stakeholder users that are going to be affected by the technology and science? What are the contexts of need and value? I mean, using these things in one way that are biomedically to cure disease can be quite different than developing those tools and technologies that might therefore advocate a political stance, a national stance, or national defense. Is there continuity of research and revision of the research necessary to remain apace with what the science and tech can do? We can't use yesterday's guidelines to guide today's and tomorrow's science. And is there consent? Now, this is where it gets tricky because consent also talks about the community of use. And increasingly, we're dealing with a cosmopolitan global community. How will those discourses proceed? What will they entail? What is the globally relevant design? Yeah, it has to be cosmopolitan, but it also has to have some combinatory construct to deal with those unique local engagements. And this is where things get really, really tricky. But what has to happen is change. The mechanisms for change essentially are what we call the P3 mechanisms. Have to be persons who are participants in the process. They have to be aligned in terms of what it is they're looking to do, and they have to have purpose to identify goals, outcomes, and the necessary administrative support and financial support to allow this to be sustainable. The P's continue. Let's keep peeing. To do this, we require a pragmatic analysis of the science and technology and of the social, political, and national spheres and domains and spaces in which the science and technology are going to be articulated. We got to be prepared, and to do that requires personnel. But those personnel have to be perceptive. They have to be pessimistic. They cannot simply be optimistic. They cannot recognize that, yes, the good is apparent. The good is what we do the things for, definable good. What tends to happen is the good wears thin with increased use over time as you get diversity of use cases. It's important to predict those use cases. What are the probabilities, possibilities, and potentials? And what are the problems? And those problems, as they occur, are they containable? Are they retrievable, reversible? And ultimately, these things will then lead at least to some element of a prudent protocol in the decisions and actions that we make towards developing policy for how these types of sciences and technologies can and should be used in the real world. Again, I think what's important for you here to understand is that this level of preparedness doesn't mean that we're going to prevent the relative promise of these positive outcomes. We're not saying stop the science, stop the technology, not at all. But we are saying be cognizant of responsive to both idiosyncratic and systemic benefits for sure, as well as burdens, risks, threats, and harms that seeking and moving towards those benefits may incur. This is what we call a preparedness process. I'm not going to read you the slide. You can read this yourself, and I make the PowerPoint available to you. And certainly this is available in many of the references that I cite at the end. But ultimately, what we're looking to do is to get smart about this. And that level of smartness engages security through management, administration, research, and training. We've called for a number of different steps, tactical approaches, Biological Information Non-Discrimination Act, and do that now. Have that in place now, based upon what we see is capabilized by the level of chem-bio interaction with the data and computational sciences. We've called for cyber biosecurity by design, ongoing surveillance of field and research development, test evaluation, and various loci and foci of use. Dialectical engagement with both our cooperators and collaborators as well as our competitors. And certainly the need for education and training that allows currency in our critique and revision. End of the day, what we're saying here is that fixity of purpose to remain ready, prepared, and therefore postured well and on our feet, capable, requires flexibility of our methods. Where are we going with this? Well, why this? I think we have to cash the reality check. This is not sci-fi. This is sci-reality. The realization of chem-bio and particularly neurocognitive science is occurring as a consequence of sophistication and capability in data and computational sciences, and reciprocally vice versa. Advances in data and computational sciences are being realized and potentiated and force multiplied by our knowledge of the brain sciences and the brain. Cashing that reality check, I think, is important for us to developing realistic insight, technical and economic savvy, because these things will affect the global bioeconomy profoundly. Again, I refer here to a paper by Joe DeFranco and Maureen Riemann, and I'll provide you that reference at the end. But throughout all of this, to reiterate the point that my colleague Diane DeUlis and I have made, it requires security by design, and that security by design must be globally relevant and responsive, not only to the realities of how the science and technology is being implemented, but also to the underlying ethics of how we're using this. And if we're considering this in military intelligence contexts, then the ethics must be focal to that effort. Take-home message. And I usually like to end talks like this by providing a little story about my dad. And I'm probably turning into my dad, who repeated the same stories and over again. So if you heard one of my lectures and I told you the story about my dad, I apologize, but I don't really give a damn. I'm going to tell you anyway. My dad was a nautical engineer. He worked for American Electric Boat for a number of years. And as an engineer, one of the things he liked to do is tinker. He liked to build stuff and fix stuff. And it was our father-son activity when I was a kid. And it's something I still like to do. I like to work on cars and airplanes and motorcycles and stuff. But my dad was a pretty good teacher too. One of the things he did with me early on is he would teach me how to use tools. And he started this when I was in first grade. And one of the things he did is he would bring home a new tool every month. He called it New Tool Tuesday. And he'd bring a new tool home every month. We'd spend a month using that tool. And the next month, we'd add it to another tool. Now, think about this. I started this when I was 6. I'm getting about 12 tools a year. And I remember there was a day I was probably around 12. So do some simple math. I started this gig when I was 6, 12 tools a year. This is 6 years later. So I had about 70 tools under my belt that I knew how to use. That's not a small toolkit. I thought I was a pretty competent tool user, not to mention the fact that I was a 12-year-old adolescent or pre-adolescent that was dipping into the hormone bucket, so I was pretty cocky and a little impulsive. It's New Tool Tuesday. My old man comes home. He's got a new tool. I was really excited. I was working on something downstairs on the workbench. He says, "Hey, look what I got for you." Great. I'm really excited. I go to grab the tool out of his hand to go run down to the workbench to use this thing. And I remember he put his hand on my shoulder. Actually, not so much. He grabbed me by the scruff of the neck like a puppy. And he said, "Hey, Jim, slow down. With this one, like with so many, you got to measure twice before you cut." Ooh, let me pass my dad's wisdom on to you. With this stuff, with ChemBio together with data and computational science and technology, we need to measure twice before we make any cuts in any particular direction. Because with this, there's no turning back. The take-home message here is that reflection, insight, and prudence have to be the stepping stones. All of our current acts of inquiry, invention, innovation, and intervention. Moreover, what we need to recognize is that the pace of measuring and cutting might be changed and grossly affected by what our international peer competitors are doing, and we need to be aware of that because that represents a reality. If you want to read more about what my group has been doing in this over the past 15 to 20 years, I provide you with this select bibliography. Of course, we'll have time for some questions afterwards, probably about 40 minutes if you have any. But if for whatever reason you don't get around to it or the questions percolate and then bubble up after the fact, feel free to reach me. You can reach me here. That's james.giordano@georgetown.edu. Once again, james.giordano@georgetown.edu. Write me right now and you will get a free ChemBio computational kit where you can make your own neuroweapons at home. That said, I thank each and all of you for your time. That was very, very kind.